doesn't want to go off.
It doesn't work.
Okay.
We got 3 working, yeah?
Yep.
Good morning, geeks and nerds, and welcome to Zzap Live 2025, the first of our talks. And we have just a short intro video for you coming up. But beware, there are flashing images. So that was just a short introductory video to show you some of the games we're going to be covering this morning, and we're going from the arcade to the bedroom with Jeff and Giles of Llamasoft. So I'd like to give a warm round of applause for our guests. And so, in the beginning, there were arcades. And Jeff, what were the games that really you got attracted to and played the most in the late 70s, early 80s in the arcades?
Well, I mean, obviously I'd seen things like the Pong games and that kind of thing, and you know, I thought they were interesting, but they didn't really grab me that much. But the first time I remember being properly addicted to an arcade game was probably when I first saw Space Invaders at a travelling fair, and I wandered in and I heard it on the news about how this new game was so popular in Japan that it was causing a shortage of coinage. I can't remember how many yen it was getting shorted, and so I thought I'd have a game. And it was interesting in a way that the Pong games weren't, because they had a bit more character, you were a bit more involved with what was going on. And I remember it seemed very difficult at first. Even if you look at Space Invaders now, it's ridiculously simple. But when the first time you were controlling that little laser base and the bombs were falling on you, it was hard to sort of settle into it. It was like a new mode of interaction that was opening up. And I found it completely fascinating. Then after that, I made a point of looking out for various arcade games. One thing that was beneficial to us was that we had my father works at the atomic weapons place at Llamasoft. They had a club you could go to if your dad worked there. There was a little pub which you could visit, which had subsidised beer. Always had some new games in there. And then that's when I first played Galaxian, and that was fascinating as well because it was the first time I'd seen a properly colour game. And then they got one in the corner, which was this weird blue maze with a weird yellow thing running around in it. We saw that for the first time there as well. I think they had Phoenix as well, which I loved. It was one of the first times I saw a game with a boss with a mothership. And yeah, so a lot of those early sprite and tile games, as they grew in colour and complexity, became increasingly interesting to me. But I think one of the major revelations I had was the first time I came across vector games. I think Asteroids, first time I saw Asteroids was in a little beach town in North Wales. I spent ages in there. And also, one game I really loved, which influenced me quite a lot, even before I started making games commercially, was Starfire. Don't you remember Exidy Starfire? You could sit down. It was like a predecessor to the Star Wars game. It had a big cabinet, like the same as the Star Wars did, but with very chunky pixel graphics. But it was a very nice game. But of course, the real life changer was when I was walking along a rainy street in London, ducked into an arcade and saw this absolutely weird thing over in the corner with this glowing web of vectors. I went, what the hell is that? I've never seen anything like that. And yeah, at that point everything changed.
And Giles, what were some of the games you played in that era that really stuck with you, that were really memorable?
Well, there weren't many, because also in Italy there was this strange law, because the video games you had to put money to play them. They were actually restricted to people 18 years old, because younger people was considered like gambling, so it wasn't allowed to play. So I had to sneak sometime when my dad was going to bars, because we didn't have any dedicated places for arcade. So normally certain bars or like pubs here would have one or two arcade machine. And the first I remember seeing, of course, was Me Too Space Invaders, which was in a black and white television, I remember, with a plastic color strips attached to the monitor to give a bit of color. But to be honest, it didn't impress me very much. But then the next video game that I see that really impressed me a lot and was quite popular in Italy, it was one of the few video games you were seeing around there and there, was Asteroids. And what was shocking was exactly this vector graphics that was so very well defined, so nice and crisp. And the game mechanic itself was very easy to understand because, you know, just shoot around and survive. And then I remember, I have a bit of a blur, I can't remember exactly what progression, but I remember at some point, one of the first video games, maybe the first one I ever seen in color was Phoenix. That was already quite a bit advanced, but I remember Phoenix, I remember Pac-Man, I remember Pengo, and of course Me Too, at some point, some place, can't remember exactly where, I've seen Tempest, and because it was vector, because it was color, because it was abstract, because it was a completely different style of game where you weren't supposed to hit anything realistic, but it was all these abstract worlds, like wow, this is really something different.
Yeah, the thing I find fascinating with Tempest is that Dave Foyer, who designed it, he said he basically had a dream where monsters were crawling out to the ground to get him, and that's
a bit of a, it's never been confirmed if it's real or if it's a rumor, but it has been written down in paper. So
That was vague, honestly, that's true. He doesn't want to talk about it because he's embarrassed. That's true, honestly.
Thanks, Paul. So yeah, and on that note, who would you say were the most influential designers at that time? The people who were really pushing arcade hardware?
That's obvious, Eugene Giles.
I guess you might say that. and Giles, when you became aware of who the designers were, was there anyone you really admired?
Oh, to be honest, I got to know about the story designer video games very, very, very much later, probably 20 to 30 years ago when I really started to know about the real names and stuff.
I mean, obviously, Dave Toyer, Ed Logg, was it Donna Bailey?
Yeah, Donna Bailey. We'll come on to that in a moment. In fact, we might as well move on to the next slide. So, Centipede begat Grid Runner and your series of games based on a grid. In fact, you actually did a ZX81 clone of Centipede, I believe.
Yeah, I did. That was one of the first games ever commercially sold. Not by, well, we did sell it as a Llamasoft game once we fell out with Decotronics, but it was originally sold by Decotronics. And yeah, it was. At that point, the time I made that game, the ZX81 version, I hadn't actually played the coin op. I'd seen it from a distance, and so I knew I could see what the basic idea was: the centipede running down and bouncing off the obstacles, which you could shoot away. But if you look at the ZX81 version, you'll notice it has a laser base, a bit like in Space Invaders. So it only moves left and right, and it doesn't go up and down, because I've never played the game. I didn't realise you could move the shooter up and down. So it's not a perfect clone. But that game I remember because it was the first time I had like a moment of fame, because it got released by Decotronics, and then I remember I was queuing up to go to one of the shows in, I think, Earl's Court. And there were some lads in front of me talking about games they were playing, and one of them said he was playing Centipede on his ZX81, and I said, do you mean Centipede by Decotronics? He's like, yeah, I really like it. I said, oh, I made that game. He was like, you must be Jeff Minter, it says so on the title screen.
And so I believe that Grid Runner itself was quite a quick development, that came out quite quickly.
Yeah, I mean, at the time, we were still all doing clones of arcade games on the early 8-bits, and I fancied doing a Centipede style game. But loads of people were doing Centipede on the VIC-20, and I was kind of itching to do something Centipede-ish, but not exactly the same. And we were at a show in London, and it was at the same time that Blade Runner came out, and they had all the posters up for Blade Runner on the tube. And I just saw the title Blade Runner, and I thought, Grid Runner, maybe, and then it gave me an idea, set it on a grid, make it a bit more futuristic, that kind of stuff. And so I went back home, and I think I started coding it on a Sunday night, and I was finished within 7 days. On the Wednesday of that week, I remember taking it, the half-finished version, into the Basingstoke Computer Club to show them, and loading it up on their VIC-20. But yeah, I always say that was the best week's work I ever did in my life, because it went on to get sold in the US, and actually went to #1 on the software charts in the US. So I was like, okay, that's a good week's work.
And you've returned to Grid Runner in several forms over the years. You refined the mechanics. What do you think? What would be your personal favourite version of it you've done?
I think it's the one from Monitor Arcade, because it plays nicely in 2D, plays nicely in VR. It is super fast and furious, but it's still really, fairly easy to get into. It's not a difficult game. I always like a game which makes a lot of noise and fireworks, but doesn't demand too much skill from the player. And
I like the fact that you have the different shape of the web, so you can have the sphere, the cylinder, the plane, so it gives a little bit of variation on the gameplay as well.
Yeah, but it does keep it fairly pure. It doesn't try and go out in as many directions as, say, Grid Runner Revolution did, to a varying degree of success. And I think in terms of all the Grid Runner games, that one retains the purity of the original, but has enough bells and whistles to make it interesting to a modern audience.
I think my personal favourite part of that version was the level names, because I mean only a British coder would get away with Cameron's Folly as a level name.
Yeah, that's one thing I've gotten into. I really enjoy putting stupid bits of text in my game, which don't particularly mean anything, and probably aren't even remotely amusing unless you're British.
And that has to be said, sometimes creates some serious problems, like with iRobot. We started to get a rejection from the quality control because they said that the grammar was wrong. And it's like,
I imagine some of those. I mean, Moose Life particularly. There's a lot of text in Moose Life between levels. I'm sure they had problems with some of that text.
I don't think we had too much problems with Moose Life, really, did we? It seemed to be fairly smooth.
No, but it was funny, for example, well, we'll get to that maybe later. When we talk about iRobot, I'll tell you what happened with iRobot.
And so, moving on, we have Defender begat Defender 2000, and of course, another early game, we mentioned the Vic just now, the Andes Attack. So obviously Defender is one that many players here will remember, and many players will remember the difficulties of the control scheme with 6 buttons.
Yeah, I mean, Defenders have been another lifelong love of mine, really, ever since I first came across it accidentally while walking across Southampton Common. And there was a fun fair there, there was a tent set up, and there was this machine outside the tent that looked like nothing else again. Most of the games back there were fairly small, little sprites on a single screen, and this thing, it still had small little sprites, but it had this mountain range, and the controls looked baffling, and the guy who was playing it kept exploding in a very pretty way. I thought, that looks interesting, I'm going to try that, and so I got on it, and then I started exploding in a very pretty way, again and again. I came away with no money and my head firmly kicked in. And so I remember saying to myself as I was walking out, my God, I hope one day I can make a game of 10th as good as that was, because it was so different. I mean, with the way things shattered and exploded, and the fact that you had the scanner and the planet, and the fact that it was just so violent but beautiful, it's stuck with me ever since. And I never thought that one day I'd actually get to meet the man who made that game, which was fantastic. But yeah, that's the start of everything with Defender for me.
Okay, and I suppose that from that you got really, your brain really got shot in the past, because now you have a lifelong addiction to particle explosion.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you can absolutely blame Eugene for that, because I do love the particles. But yeah, so I ended up doing, in the early days of the Vic, I did an absolutely shit version of Defender on the Vic. And it really was crappy. But at the time, people were releasing games on the Vic that were even more crappy than that. So somehow that got sold in America as well. I can't believe it, but there it is. They sold it as Aggressor over there. Then of course Atari started getting heavy about their copyright. So you could no longer get away with just making a game called Defender with an A on the end instead of an R. And I think you were getting around the copyright being clever. And yeah, I've done various versions over the years. I did a version on the ST which used mouse control, and there was one game reviewer at the time who still curses my name to this day because he didn't like the mouse control. Thought it was sacrilege to do Defender that way. Did Defender 2000 on the Atari Jaguar, and I think it's definitely not my best work. And I think the reason for that is that I should have stayed in Wales. All of Tempest was made in a lovely little valley in West Wales, and then for some stupid reason I decided I want to move out to the US and work for Atari directly. I became an employee living in California. And the thing is, when you're an employee, then they will lean on you a lot harder to push the game in the direction they want it to go rather than the direction I wanted it to go in. So with the result that I started doing my version of Defender with small ships, not too much going on in the background, because there's going to be lots of particles going on. It's still going to look pretty, but things are small and easily distinguishable. And they decided that instead they'd rather have multi-layers of parallax scrolling, massive great sprites, so that I had to scroll the whole screen up and down, and it just didn't suit the game of Defender really. So I did my best with what I could do when I was there, but it's not the version of Defender I would make now if I was making Defender, put it that way. And I was very glad when I got back to Wales I could make things in my own way again. I think if I'd been freelance making Defender the same way as I had Tempest, it would have been a much different and better game, and I would have been a happier person.
And one game I think you can see a lot of Defender influence in is AMC 89, the unreleased version for the Konix multi-system. We're quite fortunate now in that that's available and playable. I mean, looking back on that, do you think the Konix hardware could have succeeded, or do you think it was perhaps a stretch for the hardware?
Well, I mean, it was. If you look at the emulated version, you're probably seeing it slightly better than it actually was. I don't remember the frame rate being as good as that on real hardware. So in terms of pushing sprites around, that was approaching its limits really. It was still pretty good, and people were doing interesting stuff with sort of 3D stuff on there as well. I think the Konix could have made it if they'd had more money behind them. If they hadn't just run out of money and thrown their hands up in the air and said, we're not doing this anymore. And it's a shame that it never got released, because it did have potential. But whether it had enough hardware assist to go up alongside things like the SNES and the Mega Drive, I really don't know. I'm kind of dubious about that, to be honest.
Right, so moving on to another game. So we have Robotron begat Llamatron. Now, Llamatron is an absolutely brilliant game. I love it myself. I'm a big fan of Robotron, always have been. And obviously this then entered sort of a new era for you, selling the game shareware. I mean, let's look at the actual mechanics of the game first. What were you trying to add, trying to change when you sat down to write Llamatron?
Yeah, so the thing is, I love Robotron, obviously I do, no by YouTube. Again, it's another game which, first time you walk up to it, you're just going to get your head kicked in again and again and again. And that's fine, and it's still one of the best arcade games to play, I think, if you really are looking to chase a high score and have a real challenge. But I think one of the things you've got to do when you're transferring arcade games to the home is not just port them over as they are perfectly directly with no differences, because the aim of an arcade game is to kick your head in as quick as possible, take more money from it when you have another go. And when you're at home, I think you want something a bit more engaging than that. You want to sit down for a session on a game and settle in and have a good long play. So I didn't want to cut the balls off Robotron. I thought that would have been rude. But I still wanted to make it approachable. So one of the things that I did was introduce this idea of the AI droid, which beginning players could use, which was effectively a computer-controlled ally that would go around shooting enemies and collecting beasties for you. So if you got yourself in trouble, you could still cower in a corner and hope that the thing would sort out the trouble and save the day. And that seemed to work quite well. And then given that you were going to be on the machine for longer as a result, then obviously you needed a bit more variety of the enemies. So you had different kinds of enemies on the level that did different things, so you had to learn new techniques as you went up through the levels, and then hopefully always there were surprises. Plus, of course, it was a Llamasoft game, so it had to be full of like Monty Python style humour with the 16-ton weights, and it had to be chock full of beasties. And it seemed to work out quite well. I remember when I released it on the cover disc of SD format, and people really liked it. We'd been trying to sell it to publishers for a few months previously, and the publisher hadn't been interested. I think they thought that arcade games were over, it was a done genre and nobody was really interested in doing those things anymore. So when we got a big response from the release in shareware, it was fantastic. We were in a fairly bad financial situation at that point. We really needed to get some money into Llamasoft, and going out and doing this in shareware was quite a punt. I remember I had to argue with my parents about it and explain exactly what was going on and why we were going to be doing this. And so when the response came back, and for a few months we were getting letters, people sending us letters day after day, not only with the shareware fee, but some people would send more, and some people would often write a letter saying how much they appreciated being trusted to be given the full game and only pay if they liked it. It was really heartwarming, and I was living in Wales at the time, and my mum would fax me copies of all these letters through. I'd wake up in the morning, my fax machine would be going, rolls of stuff would be coming out. It was quite amazing. And even now, I talk to people and they still remember Llamatron fondly, so yeah, it did well. I think it succeeded in its mission.
Yeah, and you mentioned the things like 16-ton weight, and obviously memorable things like fighting against a Mandelbrot set, and there's a level where there's rain falling, and if you hit the umbrella, the rain stops. It's those sort of mechanics you've added that really do change it into a different game, that make it more of a thinking game than just a blasting game.
Yeah, it's kind of it's puzzling. There's something I like to do to this day is make it so that you can learn to play a game to get through it, but then there could be secrets on the way which you can learn so you can play it optimally and get more points. I mean, iRobot is very much like that as well.
And so moving on to one I'm sure many in the audience will love, and it's Tempest 2000, and the Jaguar. How did you find the Jaguar to work on?
Yeah, I really liked it because it was just really, really fast compared to anything I'd used before. I mean, looking back from the perspective of modern programming, you'd think it was really, really difficult because you had to do a lot of stuff yourself. You couldn't just like give it a list of triangles and say draw me some triangles. You had to set up the blitter and walk down the edges of the triangles yourself to make your own polygons, which took a bit of learning. But then considering I was coming up from like the ST and Amiga, which were both nice in their own way, but the Amiga had hardware assist, but it was more about sprites and square blitz and that kind of stuff. So the Jaguar blitter in combination with its RISC CPUs, which you could use to take a lot of the setup load off the main CPU, plus 16,000 was really quite a revelation. So I was quite impressed with the Jaguar.
Giles, have you ever tried to use the Jaguar hardware?
No, because I came out basically for what was the Xbox at the same time, so the Xbox 360, so I missed all this part. And to be honest, when I was working before, it was completely different sector, it was in industrial automation, so it wasn't really video game. But yeah, basically my experience really like professional the video game developer began with the Xbox 360 and a bit laterally with the GameCube.
And so from pretty much from Tempest onwards, I feel that the sound and the music have become more important in your games, in that a lot of the time you're using sound cues when things happen in the game. So do you think that that is a good way of helping the player, that giving them the sound cue so they know something has happened?
Yeah, I mean basically sound and music became a lot more important to me around the sort of early 90s, I suppose. After I had my first pill, and that kind of turned me on to techno music. I hadn't really understood it before then. I'd loved my rock and roll, but I thought all this bleeping and blooping stuff was a bit rubbish. But then I had my Damascene conversion after that experience, and I understood about all the electronic stuff, and so that was why the soundtrack to Tempest is so good. And I'd always had an interest in light synths, obviously, but it also kind of amped up to 11 my intention to bring more light synth stuff into video games. And yeah, I think because everything worked out so well with Tempest, I became probably more aware of audio in general and its deployment in games, and I started to use it for positional and indication of events happening that could be happening off screen, could be happening elsewhere in the game universe. I mean, Defender does it right from the start, as we hear a little when the landers pick up the humanoids. But yeah, the more I used it, I think the more effective it became, and so I started using it in everything. It culminated in Space Giraffe. You needed to use like 7 of your senses to be able to understand what was going on any given level.
And that's a good time to move on to the next slide. So we're moving into the era of the iOS games for Monitor Arcade and the Neon Light Synth for Xbox 60, which we just touched on, and Space Giraffe as a game. So we might as well go to Space Giraffe there, which has had a bit of a Marmite reaction over the years. How did you feel when it got some severe criticism from people who had obviously not played the game much?
Yeah, I mean, it was a pain in the tits, really. I think what really upset me was that I'd given a copy to original Xbox magazine, and I really wasn't expected to be stabbed in the back by the actual the publisher of the official Xbox magazine, and they published their review before my game came out. It's like they were trying to bury me before it even went out the front door. But then again, I mean, the guy obviously hadn't understood what was going on, fair enough. A lot of other people did understand it and thought it was really good, and these days, the people who love it still love it. The people who didn't like it back then have probably forgotten about it, and I still think it's one of the best things I've ever made.
This thing also has been quite a technical achievement, if you remember the proof of concept in 2 weeks.
No, that is fast, yeah.
But yeah, I still think that Space Giraffe is the game I'm probably most proud of, and it's one I do want to make a sequel to before I finish making games forever, you know. And the sequel will be in VR, will be even more trippy than the original one.
much more.
And obviously that's a good point to bring up, the Neon system that has been in the background of your games recently. Giles, what was your input, your main aim with the...
Well, let's say that because in the beginning we were working, let's say, for a single platform at the time, but then at some point we started to do games for more platforms. It came at some point apparent that we were doing and redoing a lot of things in many times different ways. So it came the idea, why don't we try to create something, let's say, a bit more generic, so we can make the game with this environment, and then at this environment target different platforms. And so, let's say, it started like an idea just to try to put together something that was, let's say, a bit more reusable, and at the same time also to have this power, to have this like this synthesizer, a bit like disconnected from the game itself, because in the beginning some of the stuff it wasn't clear of a distinction between where was the synthesizer, where was the game. It was all mixed together. In fact, Spicy Rough is a lot of people, why we haven't ported it to another place, quite difficult to put hands on it, the way the code was done that way, which was done also quite quickly because we had to do everything. But yeah, I mean, I am at the moment, let's say, the one that maintains the engine. I mean, of course, Jeff has do some of the main ideas, but then I do all the posts for all the various different platforms. I do all the various different adaptations, and I keep it aligned all for. Because then the complication also is when you do one thing for different platforms. Of course, maybe a certain platform cannot do exactly what the other does, but you still want to have something that you can call and use and get at least a 99% similar effect. And that gets complicated. Also think about how can I do something that from a game point of view is generic, so see, let's say, a coherent set of APIs, while they have all this other that is completely different from which one from the other. So you have to. But my work is keeping all this thing working.
Yeah, it's in the background, but it's important to the game.
Yeah, I mean, you must understand that all my recent games, ever since Giles has been with us, have been built on a strong framework of Italian swear words.
And that's how we learned Italian.
No.
So what's the swear words first?
And I know the iOS era was quite difficult for you, and you felt, what were good games you were putting out. I'm a big fan of the Minotaur arcade games. The example on the screen here is 5 a day, and I felt they were brilliant games, and I was really sad when I had to update my iPad and lost access to them. I mean, I feel that there was still something untapped there. There was more games you could have done.
Yeah, but there was only so long I could stick it out, really. It was intensely frustrating period for us, because when I first got onto the iOS, I thought this could be a lot of fun. We could do some nice, fun little small projects, a bit like it was in the Commodore 64 days, where we could, bang out a game in 3 or 4 months, and then move on and do something new. Also, I quite enjoyed the challenge of making them play well using the touchscreen controls, because at that time, a lot of games just had virtual D-pads that were absolutely horrible to use. So, I settled down to doing them, and they came out all right, and every time they get reviewed, they got fantastic reviews, and then every time you make about 50p, and then you have to put your disappointment to one side, do it all over again, work yourself up into making another really good game, hope for it to do better, and then make bloody 50p again. After you've done that for like 2 years, it was like, no, I have had enough of this, I'm never going near mobile again. And I think part of the problem is that it seemed to be what was more important to the success of a mobile game was its visibility and marketing, rather than the actual nature of the game. And despite getting good reviews everywhere, the good reviews didn't seem to count for anything. If you weren't in that top 10 list that appeared on iOS, then you might as well give up and go home. It was just pointless.
Yeah, I think what played in our disfavor was that we were really at the beginning of the stuff, when the thing was still in this very beginning. And let's say, if we could have sold those games, let's say at £5 each, we maybe could have been still there. But then almost immediately came the story of a game at £1, then 99p. Then they started with the idea that the game should be free to play. And then there was all the stories behind about that exactly. Basically, if you were not in the top 10 list, you were like not being anywhere because there were so many games, so much software, so much stuff coming out that you were completely submerged in the stuff. And I think what fooled a lot of people was the thinking, yeah, but there are millions of users on the iOS stuff. Even if I take a very, very small percentage, it should still be good. But the reality is you don't get not even that. I mean, if you really are not in the top tier or promoted or stuff, or you have a lot of viral success, your game does not exist.
So there was one time that we were actually in the App Store top 10, but unfortunately it had about as much significance as a fart in a gale, because that was for the Mac.
OS X, yeah.
And then in a lot of ways, those games used a lot of arcade mechanics. Was there any sort of game you wanted to try with the touchscreen? Any particular game you wanted to sort of reframe in that style?
Yeah, I mean, some of the work obviously would work well the way you'd imagine. I mean, in the ones which control like asteroid ships work fairly well on the touchscreen naturally. But then I had other games, like there was a game which was a bit like Lunar Lander, where you Caverns of Minos, where you had to have a thrust style control, and that seemed to work fairly well. Also, I'd never really done a platform game, unless you count Centipede as a platform game. I ended up doing a couple of those on iOS, even including editors. Goes Up and Goes Up 2, and they work quite well. And I think we did fairly well with the controls, because like I say, there was so much bad control out there in those days that I figured I really wanted to put time into making it feel and play well. There's no point in getting a game which looks nice but then feels like crap to play. And yeah, as I say, once you get used to the fact that you haven't got a D-pad and you start designing arcade games with touchscreen control, you realise it can be done quite effectively. There are some experimental control methods which I still haven't used, which I've still got up my sleeve one of these days, which I might do should I encounter a touchscreen again, but it probably won't be a touchscreen on mobile, that's the thing.
So moving on, in recent years you've returned to work with Atari. We have Aka R on screen, and obviously recent release iRobot. How do you find working with Atari these days?
I've got to say, it's really good for us these days, because at the moment, it has been for ages quite hard to make your way as an independent publishing your own stuff. In order to get any kind of success, you really need the kind of skill set which we don't have. We're not really into marketing and that kind of stuff. We are just two guys sitting with their heads down writing code in West Wales. So the arrangement we have with Atari is fantastic, where basically they let us wander through their back catalogue and pick something out that we're interested in, and then we negotiate a price and we go away and do it. And they don't try and lean on us too hard, they don't try and force our hand creatively, they don't mind when I fill it full of Llamasoft junk, and they seem very happy with the end result, and we get an agreed sum payment, so we have continuous and steady employment. So we're happy, they're happy, and as long as they're happy to keep on giving us these kind of opportunities, I think we're going to carry on taking them,
Yeah, and obviously Atari have their own recharged line of games where they've been bringing back some properties, and you probably can't reveal what you're working on at the moment, but are there any you have your eye on for the future?
Well, yes, we've just finished iRobot. I do want to say whoever was playing that clip of iRobot at the start didn't know what the hell they were doing.
That was me, that was me.
So we were having a Zoom meeting the other day to discuss what to do next, and they'd sent me the current catalogue of IP, and I'd looked through it, and they said they'd think about the kind of thing they might want me to do as well, and we'd talk about the results between us. And so I said, yeah, I've looked through and I've got these two games here which I think really could suit me down to the ground, and it was the same two games they'd been thinking of. So yeah, all being well, it looks like my next two jobs are sorted out.
And Giles, are you enjoying looking through Atari's back catalogue?
No, to be honest, I let him look because he's the creative part of the game. But I'm trying more to convince Atari about a few things that I'm still trying to push. Because one thing that we done, it did exist, but we can't put it out anywhere. But what I'm still experimenting a little bit with VR. It does exist a version of Tempest in VR, and it is really gorgeous. Something you've never seen, is absolutely. And I'm trying to convince Atari to say, please let me do Tempest VR, let me do Tempest VR.
And so then, looking to the future, we've had the recent Llamasoft, the Jeff Minter story compilation from Digital Eclipse, which is absolutely fantastic, which sort of sums up a large chunk of your career. And later this year will be the Heart of Neon documentary film, which is coming out. And we have stickers over here if you want to pick one up, and there's more merchandise on sale on the Cytronic stand in the other room. This is an interesting point in your career. Looking to the future, how do you want to go forward?
Well, basically, I want to carry on staying alive, so hopefully we get some more projects from Atari, and I didn't get terminally ill or anything. That would be good. I want to develop the light synth further, but I think we can fold that into our game development, since the light synth is a fundamental part of our game engine anyway. And that needs to be developed a bit more for the next game we're doing. And I think the thing I'm really leading up to is I would like to do Space Giraffe 2. Because I think Space Giraffe is one of the best things I've ever made. I would like to push out further in that direction. That would be the vehicle to do it with, and I need a good light synth under me to do that. And so this development work we're doing now will lead towards that.
And the Llamasoft, the Jeff Minter story, as I referred to, it sort of feels like being given a lifetime achievement award. Did you enjoy working with them on that?
Yeah, I mean it was good. I mean, having seen the job they'd done for Atari, I was amazed to think that they were going to be doing the same thing for Llamasoft. It was quite an emotional journey at times, because I had to dig out a lot of archived material. In the process of doing that, you see places and people that you're never going to see again, which was quite deeply affecting at times. But yes, I'm very glad it's out there. Something I'd always thought it might be nice to do for myself one day is have some kind of archive, but they've made a far better job of it than I could ever have done myself. Plus, we've had the help of lots of other people putting together bits of archive which I didn't have. So yeah, it is a fantastic record of my early to mid career, which I'm very glad it exists.
And Giles, is there any particular project, anything you would like to do in the future?
Well, I would like to extend more to do let's say, keep perfectioning the engine, adding a few more features. We are now working something a bit more around the audio stuff, so I want to make it more sophisticated. And I would like to expand it more into the VR, so be able to support more VR devices. But anyway, keep it going, keep it better, make it bigger, and be able to make even more best-looking games.
Well, I think the most important and the most valuable product of Llamasoft is Happy Sheep.
Well, Llamasoft definitely will not exist without the sheep. That's a guarantee.
So we're going to do a little bit of a twist now, because Giles has got a question he wants to ask the audience.
Yeah, actually it's two questions, but the first question, just simple number one, is did any of you ever play Space Giraffe?
Yeah.
Okay. How many years Space Giraffe is out? Quite a bit.
23.
23, okay. Have you ever, any of you, found the mini Easter egg that is in Space Giraffe? Okay, I will only tell you, you don't need to disassemble the game or do anything like that. Actually, you will not find it in that way. You don't need to do incredibly weird things. It's there, but you have to look carefully. There is a mini Easter egg that no one has ever found yet. You have to look carefully.
And Jeff, have you got a question for the audience?
Can I have a beer?
there is not a prize that we're not told about. We can't really give you a prize, but you will be famous for finally finding us for 23 years. And it's something that is always there. He's always been there, under your eyes. But you have to look carefully.
Okay then, I'm gonna come down and bring the mic round. If we've got any questions we'd like to ask.
Hello, thank you. Hello. So you've talked about the games that influenced you, but how did you actually get started programming?
I walked into the wrong room at sixth form college, basically. At secondary school, it was before schools had computers. We had some adding machines with a crank on the side. That was the closest thing we had to computers there. Obviously, there were calculators, but we didn't have anything with a screen. And so I had no idea that I would have any interest in computing. I was going to sixth form college not really knowing what I was going to be doing. I think the exams I was taking at sixth form were kind of English, so it was English, maths and physics. It was this weird mix of kind of arts and sciences, and I wasn't really sure which way I was going to go. Walked into the wrong room accidentally one day, found a guy sitting in front of this weird thing that looked like a little telly on top, and he was playing a video game on it. And I asked him how does that happen? How come you're playing a video game on this weird thing? He said that he typed it in. And I was like, what? You can type on this thing and make games? And he explained to me what BASIC was. And so I went to the library and got a book on BASIC and started coming in early to school and hack on the machines whenever I could, or the one machine we had, whenever I could. And I discovered it was the one thing which brought together the sort of artistic and technical sides of my nature in a perfect way. It was just incredibly compelling, the idea that you could make things just by saying the words of power. It was like being a wizard. It was fantastic. So yeah, it just took my life over at that point. I never looked back.
Don't know many other Atari games, but I look forward to your version of Hard Driving anyway.
I can tell you the cow will be very detailed.
On a similar note to that hidden Easter egg, did many people find the hidden sweary bit in Llamatron?
Yeah, they did. They did.
Right.
I mean, it wasn't even intentionally left there in Llamatron. The idea was that you'd fire off one sample and then a second sample would trigger to cut off the first half of the first one, or the second half of the first one, I should say. But I didn't bother actually truncating the first sample, and it turned out if you happen to pause the game just after the first sample trigger, but before the secondary one triggered to cut off the end, then it would play the full sample. So it would say, "Fuck."
That was your voice, was it?
It was my voice, and
I'm so proud of finding that.
and I got a few letters about that. So I went on and made Rude Llamatron, which was made by it was over a weekend by me and a bunch of my mates who'd come up to stay in my house in Wales, and we all got very stoned and sat around and made this long tirade of swearing, which was inserted into the game and released as Rude Llamatron. And at that time, my old school friend, a guy called Richard Miller, was pretty much, he was head of R&D at Atari in the US. And I had this Rude Llamatron running on my Atari TT, which was with the development system for the Jaguar. I sent a copy out to Richard and said, have a look at this. You're British, you won't mind when it says "come." and so he started playing this, and he was playing Rude Llamatron in his office, and his secretary went in just at the moment where he lost his life, and it went, "Bollocks, piss flaps, cunt, 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 fucking shit, you bastard, fuck pig." And apparently she just turned around in horror and legged it out of the room.
Well, it's quite difficult to follow there, Jen. First of all, that was great, all three of you. Thank you very much. I've got two questions. The First of all, there's a lot of the games that inspired you, arcade games, have very specific controls. The spinner on Tempest, the trackball on Centipede, Defender's buttons, the twin joysticks of Llamatron. And I just wondered, was it frustrating not having access to those kind of unique controls? And did you in fact ever sort of advocate or argue to get some controls? And my second question is you once said something that really stuck with me, and you said with arcade games, with no idea who made them, they might as well have been made by the gods, which I thought was a brilliant thing you said. Because it's weird, because we knew you'd made your games. We could see them, and we'd meet you at shows. Not true with arcade games. So, either of you, have you ever met some of the people, you know, Eugene Jarvis, Ed Larg, Dave Toyer? Have you ever met them, and what was it like? Were you starstruck?
Well, I mean, on the first of those, the controls, I've never really been that bothered by having to use different controls from the arcade. I mean, most of them in the early days were digital. Even if there were buttons, you could pretty much simulate the buttons on using a joystick and the single button, so it wasn't too bad. I actually quite enjoyed the challenge of making arcade controls work on the touchscreen on the phone. I had like a version of Llamasoft where the firing was completely automatic and you just guided the guy around with your finger. And I think they eventually did that. Doesn't that Vampire Survivors game do that? But yeah, I was doing it 10 years before that, and it works pretty well. So I didn't pester for different controls. It was Atari's idea to at least put in stub code to support a spinner on the original Tempest 2000. And yeah, it is nice to be able to play that way, but I understand why the release wasn't big enough and wide enough to consider including a special controller packed in with the game. It would have been lovely, but maybe a large Japanese firm could have done it, but not Atari at that time. And as for meeting, well, I spent a very happy day in September last year being the guest of Eugene Jarvis at his Raw Thrills factory. He showed me all his new games. He took me out to an arcade. Well, I think it's supposed to be one of the biggest arcades in the world. It's quite a famous one. And it's brilliant because we walked in there, and normally you'd have to pay, I can't remember, $30 or whatever for a day there. I walked in next to Eugene Jarvis, so I got to do whatever the hell I wanted. It was lovely. There was a whole row of Eugene's games there, and I actually got to play them at doubles on Llamatron, which is like, wow. And actually, after that trip, I could almost dive on to heaven because I was talking to him, we were talking about Llamatron and Llamatron. He says that he thought that the only game that ever was a proper true sequel to Llamatron was Llamatron. It was the only one which really had the spirit of the original game and it was worthy of being a sequel. I was like, okay, I'll take that.
Swearing one or the other.
Hello. Like yourself, I was inspired and sort of blown away by the same games that you mentioned earlier, Jeff, which were like the very first one that, because I'm a little bit younger perhaps than some of the other audience members, just by 5 years or so. One of the games that first impressed me was Galaxian in the arcade. I remember putting many 10p's in that and trying to get as many flags as I could. What I was going to ask you is two things. First of all, I got into Llamasoft games by there was a famous cartoonist, John Lennon was a big fan of him, and his name was Jack Edward Oliver. He sadly passed away to cancer, I think it was pancreatic cancer. And I brought his old games on eBay, and I found all these Llamasoft games in there where he put his high scores in literally every game. The clamshell had got like a high score, and he was obviously a huge fan of you, Jeff, and he was quite famous. He did cartoons for like Topper and things like that, so I just thought I'd mention him. But my question is, what I was blown away with next was a game called Space Harrier by Yu Suzuki, the Japanese programmer. And I was wondering, did you ever play that, either of you, or did you, because that was a shooter, more like a rail shooter. But I was really blown away by the kind of 3D, sort of the things flying at the screen, and that was a huge, being a kid seeing that, going from like Galaxian and perhaps the earlier games like Defender, Space Invaders, obviously things like that, to see a game like Space Harrier really blew my mind at the time. So I was going to ask if either of you played it and what you thought of Yu Suzuki's games. And
Yeah, I mean, I was actually at there was an arcade operators exhibition in London I used to go to just to see what was upcoming back in the day. And that's where I went to the exhibition where they released Space Harrier. And yes, it was very, very impressive. Obviously they demonstrated the sit-down version with the motion and the huge screen. And the sprite scaling really, really impressed me. It's like, oh my god, I wish we could do that on the Commodore 64. And I wish we had that many colours as well. But yeah, so it was the start. Was it the start of the? Well, I suppose there were Sega Superscaler games before that, but this was kind of like one of the defining steps in along that particular route. Yeah, very impressive. Played it a lot.
I want to add I did play it as well because everyone knows Space Harrier. I mean, it's quite famous. But one version that, of course, at some point there were being made some conversion for our home machines. One version that plays really well and has quite that feeling of that hydraulic stuff is the ZX Spectrum conversion. I don't know if you've ever seen it. But that I think was considered one of the best home conversions for the game. And I remember it, the way it moves, it was pretty smooth.
The PC Engine version. The PC Engine version was very good as well.
Yeah, I've got that as well.
Question for, first of all, thank you for your legacy and everything you've done. A question for Giles. Are you doing any work on porting the engine to Switch 2?
This is a good question, and I can tell you that Atari is still trying to get me a Switch 2 dev kit. But as soon as I have one, I'll be doing for it.
Okay, just one last quick question.
Hello again. Last Zzap we had a brew outside, and I sort of strong-armed you to demo at the Pytrex using the Raspberry Pi to leave the Vectrex because the only display of vector graphics was there. And I was saying that everyone's doing Jeff games on there, and both of you had a quick look at it last year. Did you put any more thought into doing any work on the Vectrex using the Raspberry Pi on that?
Well, we haven't really had a chance yet. We were so busy. We've been absolutely balls deep in getting iRobot ready on something like 6 or 7 different systems. We've only just let off with that, so we haven't had a lot of spare time really. That's the only reason we haven't looked at too much. They've got other coding.
Now really, I would say with iRobot, it's been one of the projects where we did work really a lot on it. It's been like day and night, until especially until the end, because this time they decided to make all the 6 certification all at once, which in retrospective wasn't probably the best choice, but we made it. But it's been really intense.
Yeah, that was god tier Italian swearing going.
And on that note, I think we'll bring this to a close. I just want to say thank you to Jeff and Giles, and thank you to the audience for the questions. And afterwards, we've got posters if you want to come over to this side here. The signing, and I hope you've all enjoyed the talk.
Yes.